August 7th, 1942, 14:14 p.m. 18 Japanese Zero fighters drop out of the clouds above Guadalcanal like falling knives. They are not here to scout. They are not here to patrol. They are here to kill. And for the first 7 months of this war, that is exactly what they have done everywhere, every time, against every Allied pilot who had the misfortune of climbing into the sky to meet them. Kill ratios of 12-1. Entire squadrons erased in minutes. American pilots issued standing orders never to turn with a zero under any circumstances. The recommended tactic was simple dive run, pray for clouds. But on this afternoon, something is different. The Americans are turning. Not running. Turning into the attack. Two Wildcats, slower and weaker than anything the Japanese are flying, are moving toward each other in a pattern the Zero pilots have never seen. And when the best fighter pilot in the Imperial Navy commits to his attack run, he finds impossibly that there is already an American gun pointed directly at his face. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This channel is where forgotten heroes get the record they deserve. What you are about to hear is the story of a soft-spoken man from Arkansas who sat down at a kitchen table with a box of matchsticks and accidentally rewrote the rules of air combat forever. His name was almost never spoken outside naval aviation circles. He held no political office. He invented no weapon. He built no aircraft. He simply thought harder than anyone else about a problem that was killing American pilots by the dozen, and then he solved it with geometry. The tactic he invented would produce a kill ratio of 13-1. It would be taught in every Western air combat training course for the next 80 years. It would survive the Zero, survive the MiG, survive the Cold War. And it began on a night in the summer of 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, in a rented house in Coronado, California, when a 36-year-old naval officer read an intelligence bulletin and could not sleep. By late 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy had built something the world had never seen before. Not just an air force, a religion. The Yokarin program, launched in 1930, took boys aged 15 to 17 and subjected them to a training pipeline so savage that in 1937, when 500 sailors applied, 70 were accepted and 25 graduated. One of those 25 was a young man named Saburo Sakai, who received a silver watch from Emperor Hirohito for graduating first in his class. By the time he was 23, he was one of the most dangerous fighter pilots alive. He could put a burst into a target the size of a dinner plate from 300 meters. He could read surface wind off the ocean from 5,000 feet. He had been killing Allied pilots since the war in China. And then there was the aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. Chief Engineer Jiro Horikoshi had stripped it to the bone in pursuit of one principle: it would outturn anything in the sky. Armor plate behind the pilot seat gone. Self-sealing fuel tank lining gone. Wing skin thinned to the edge of structural reason. What remained could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute, engage at ranges no Allied fighter could match, and outmaneuver every opponent it had met in China, the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. Allied pilots who tried to dogfight a Zero died. That was not a theory. That was the established fact of the first 6 months of the Pacific War, written in wreckage across 4,000 miles of ocean. Into this situation walked John Smith Thatch. His friends called him Jimmy because an older brother named James had arrived at the Naval Academy first, and the upperclassmen had assigned the nickname before Jimmy could object. He was tall, quiet, and unhurried in his speech, in the way that men from Arkansas sometimes are, the kind of man who gave you the impression that he had already thought 3 moves ahead and was simply waiting for you to catch up. He had not topped his class at Annapolis. He had not built his reputation on daring stunts. He had built it on thinking problems all the way down until they came apart in his hands. In September of 1941, he was commanding Fighting Squadron 3 at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego when a document landed on his desk that stopped him cold. The Fleet Air Tactical Unit Intelligence Bulletin of September 22nd described the Mitsubishi Zero pieced together from Flying Tiger combat reports over China as a fighter that climbed at more than 5,000 feet per minute and turned inside any American aircraft known to exist. The actual figure was closer to 3,100 feet per minute, but the bulletin overstated it. Either way, the arithmetic was brutal. The F-4F Wildcat that Thatch and his pilots flew was about to go to war against an airplane it could not climb with, could not turn with, and could not outrun. He took the bulletin home to the rented house in Coronado. He read it once, then again, then a third time. According to his own oral history given years later to the United States Naval Institute, he sat down at his kitchen table that night with a box of ordinary matchsticks and began to move them. The matchsticks were aircraft. The wood grain patterns on the table were sky. He arranged them, attacked them, defended them, broke them apart, and started over. He did this every night for weeks. Midnight at the kitchen table. Test flight the next morning over San Diego Bay. Evening debrief. Back to the matchsticks. The first thing he found was that the standard American three-plane formation was geometrically hopeless. Two wingmen flanking a leader meant both wingmen spent most of their energy holding position. They could not check their own tails. They were prisoners of their own geometry. The basic tactical unit had to be smaller. It had to be a pair. Two aircraft, side by side, each pilot responsible for watching the sky behind the other man's aircraft. The United States Navy formally adopted the two-plane section as its basic fighter element in July of 1941, partly on his recommendation. That change alone mattered, but it was not enough. Two Wildcats flying together. No matter how alert, still could not survive against a faster opponent who could choose when to attack, miss deliberately, and climb away beyond reach to try again. A pair had no answer for a Zero that refused to commit. He kept moving the matchsticks. And then, on one of those late nights in Coronado, with the house quiet and his wife Malene asleep, he found something that changed everything. Two pairs. Four aircraft flying abreast, separated by a distance roughly equal to the Wildcat's turning radius. A Zero attacks the left pair. The right pair immediately turns toward the attack. The left pair turns toward the right pair. They cross paths. The Zero, committed to the bait, suddenly finds itself head-on to the guns of the second pair, which has done nothing more complicated than turn left at the correct moment. If the Zero presses its attack, it dies. If it breaks off, the rescuers swing around onto its tail. There is no third exit from the geometry. The trap does not care how skilled the Zero pilot is. It does not care how good his aircraft is. It only requires that two pairs of pilots execute one simple turn at the right moment. Any reasonably trained pilot could do it. That was the point. That was the entire point. He called it the beam defense position in his official correspondence because the second pair arrived from the beam, the side of the attacker. His pilots called it the weave almost immediately because from altitude, that was exactly what it looked like. Two pairs of fighters weaving through each other's flight paths like threads on a loom. The name that would outlast everything the Thatch Weave was given to it by his close friend Lieutenant Commander James Flatley the following year. But the idea lived first on a kitchen table in Coronado, built from matchsticks by a man who had decided that American pilots were not going to die simply because the other side had a better airplane. He knew that an idea this strange had to be proven before anyone would trust their life to it. And so, in the autumn of 1941, he called on his second section leader, a 27-year-old Irish-American ensign named Edward Henry Butch O'Hare, the finest natural pilot in VF-3, and told him exactly what he needed. O'Hare would play the attacker. Full throttle, every angle, every altitude, every trick he knew. Thatch would play the defender with one critical constraint. His throttles would be wired at half power. Locked. He could not cheat his way out of trouble with speed. He had to solve it with geometry alone or not at all. They went up over San Diego Bay. O'Hare attacked from above, from behind, from the quarter, from the beam, from every angle his considerable talent could produce. and every single time with half their available power, Thatch's defenders either spoiled the shot or turned to put their own guns on the attacker. When they landed and taxied back to the line, O'Hare climbed out of his cockpit, walked across the tarmac with his flight helmet still buckled, and said the words that became the foundation of American carrier fighter doctrine for the rest of the war. "Skipper," he said. "It really worked. I couldn't make any attack without seeing the nose of one of your airplanes pointed at me." That was November 1941. In 7 weeks, Pearl Harbor would be burning. In 7 months, the skies over Midway would decide the course of the Pacific War, and Jimmy Thatch would be there with 6 Wildcats. One green wingman who had practiced the weave exactly once. One pilot whose radio was completely dead, and a formation of 15 to 20 Imperial Navy Zeros waiting to kill all of them. What happened next in those 4 minutes over the Japanese fleet is one of the most violent and precise demonstrations of pure tactical thinking in the history of aerial warfare. But to understand what Thatch was actually up against above Midway, and why the Japanese had no answer for what was coming, you first need to understand the man who had built their entire air war on an idea that was about to be proven fatally wrong. In Part 2, we go to Midway. We go inside that cockpit, and we find out whether a tactic built on a kitchen table with matchsticks actually holds together when the Zeros are real, the bullets are real, and one of your pilots is already dead in the first 30 seconds. Last time, a quiet man from Arkansas named Jimmy Thatch read an intelligence bulletin that should have made him quit, sat down at a kitchen table with a box of matchsticks, and built a trap for the finest fighter pilots in the world. He proved it in the air above San Diego Bay, against Butch O'Hare, the best pilot in his squadron, with his throttles wired to half power. The weave worked, every single time. But proving something on a test flight over California is not the same as convincing the United States Navy to change how it fights a war. And in the winter of 1941, the Navy was not in a mood to hear that everything it knew about fighter tactics was wrong. Here is a number that puts what Thatch was walking into in perspective. In the 6 months between Pearl Harbor and Midway, American carrier fighter squadrons were losing pilots at a rate that the Bureau of Aeronautics could not publicly acknowledge without causing a collapse in recruiting. The standing doctrine divide your section, pursue aggressively. Trust your gunnery was producing a kill ratio of roughly 1 to 3 in the Zero's favor. For every Japanese pilot American squadrons were shooting down, they were losing 3 of their own. The men writing the tactical manuals in Washington knew this. They chose not to revise the manuals anyway, because revising the manuals meant admitting the manuals had been wrong. Thatch submitted his formal report on the beam defense position in early 1942. He included the test data from San Diego. He included O'Hare's own account. He requested that the 2-section weave be adopted as standard doctrine across all carrier fighter squadrons immediately. The response from the staff at COM-AirPac Commander Air Forces Pacific was essentially a polite version of no. The officer who reviewed the report, a captain whose name has been omitted from most accounts out of professional courtesy, called Thatch into a meeting in early spring of 1942. The exchange, reconstructed from Thatch's oral history, went approximately as follows. The captain looked up from the report and said, "This is a defensive tactic." Thatch said, "Yes, sir, it is. We do not train fighter pilots to think defensively." Sir Thatch said, "We are losing 3 pilots for every Zero we shoot down. The current doctrine is not aggressive. It is suicidal." The captain set the report down. He said, "Our pilots need better gunnery training and more aggression in the merge, not a new formation that asks them to fly at half power and wait for the enemy to attack." Thatch left that meeting without authorization to implement anything. He had 6 weeks before the Japanese fleet would be positioned north of Midway. He was running out of time to prove something that men were dying every day for lack of. And then he found James Flatley. Lieutenant Commander James Flatley was the executive officer of Fighting Squadron 42, which had just come off the carrier Yorktown after Coral Sea. He had watched his pilots fight Zeros over the Coral Sea in May, and had come home with the same cold arithmetic that Thatch had been staring at for months. He had also read Thatch's report. not the summary. The full report with the test data. When Thatch found him, Flatley had one question. He said, "Does it work against a pilot who knows it's coming?" Thatch said, "O'Hare knew it was coming, knew exactly what I was going to do. He still could not find a clean attack run." Flatley looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "Show me." They went up together over Pearl Harbor. Flatley played the Zero. Thatch played the Weave. The result was the same as San Diego. Flatley landed, walked to the operations shack, and immediately began incorporating the Weave into the training syllabus for the pilots of his new assignment, Fighting Squadron 10, which would eventually fly from the Enterprise. He also did something more immediately useful. He walked Thatch through the door of the office of Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch, who had commanded the carrier forces at Coral Sea and had the kind of combat credibility that made staff captains sit down and listen. Fitch read the report. He looked at Flatley, who had just flown against the tactic himself. Flatley said, "Admiral, I flew the attacker's position for 40 minutes and I could not solve it once." Fitch signed the authorization for a formal fleet-wide review of the beam defense position the same afternoon. That authorization did not change the tactical manuals. That would take months. But it gave Thatch what he needed. It gave him permission to take 6 Wildcats to Midway and fly the Weave in actual combat. 6 fighters. Not 16. Not 60. 6. Against what the Japanese carrier fleet was bringing north of Midway. June 4, 1942. 8:40 local time. The Yorktown launches its strike group. Thatch gets 6 Wildcats to cover Torpedo Squadron 3. 12 Douglas Devastator. Torpedo bombers flying at 115 knots low and slow, directly into the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific. 6 fighters to cover an entire torpedo squadron. The math is already impossible before the first Zero appears. Thatch looks at what he has. Ensign Robert Dibb, everyone calls him Ram, is 21 years old and has practiced the Weave exactly once. Lieutenant Brainerd McCuskey is on loan from VF-42, and his radio is dead, completely dead, which means Thatch cannot talk to him for the entire engagement. 2 more Wildcats are peeled off as low cover for the torpedo planes, which drops his available fighters for the Weave from 6 to 4, and 4 is not divisible into 2 clean pairs of 2. He has to revise the geometry in the air on the fly with a green wingman and a pilot who cannot hear a word he says. The Zeros hit them before they reach the fleet. The first pass comes from above and from the right. Bassett's Wildcat takes multiple hits on the opening burst slants toward the water and burns. He is dead before his aircraft reaches the surface. McCuskey takes fire too, but stays airborne. Thatch is now down to 3 functioning Wildcats against a combat air patrol the Naval Aviation Museum later estimates at 15 to 20 Zeros over his immediate engagement area. He has approximately 4 seconds to decide what to do. He waves Dibb out to the right. Wide. He signals by hand across the cockpit. Gap, no radio, no intercom. Just one hand out the window in the slipstream for McCuskey to follow Dibb. Then he does the thing that requires more nerve than anything else in his record. He offers Dibb as bait. Dibb understands. He turns outbound. The Zeros come for him the way they always come. One committed attacker focused on the target in front of him, the way the Yokerin doctrine had taught him to fight since he was 17 years old. Dibb calls for help and turns hard back toward Thatch. Thatch turns into him. McCuskey, not knowing what is happening, but following his orders, turns with Dibb. The Zero following Dibb through the turn comes across Thatch's nose. Thatch fires. The burst walks from the engine, cowling back along the fuselage. The Zero sheds pieces of its cowling and goes down burning. He does it again. Another Zero commits to Dibb. Dibb turns. Thatch is already there. Another burst. Another Zero in flames. One Zero pilot, seeing what is happening, tries to follow Dibb through the Weave instead of breaking off. He passes directly in front of Thatch at close range, still correcting his aim for a target that is no longer where he expected it to be. Thatch kills him in passing without breaking stride. By the time the Japanese cap breaks contact and climbs away, VF-3 has been credited with multiple confirmed kills. Thatch claims 3 personally. Dibb claims 1. 5 of the 6 surviving Wildcats turned back toward the Yorktown. 1 pilot dead in the opening seconds. 1 radio completely silent for the entire engagement. A formation improvised by hand signal in the air. And the Weave had worked against 15 to 20 Zeros, with exactly the geometry Thatch had built from matchsticks 8 months earlier on a kitchen table in Coronado. When Thatch sat down in the Yorktown's ready room that evening to write his after-action report, he wrote that any success against the Zero was due to the poor marksmanship of the Japanese, the stupid mistakes of a few of their pilots, and the teamwork of his own men. He was characteristically leaving himself out of the sentence entirely. But somewhere over the Solomon Islands, 400 miles to the southwest, the pilots of the Tainan Air Group were about to encounter the Weave for the first time, without knowing what it was or where it came from. And their questions, the ones they couldn't stop asking each other in the barracks at Rabaul, were about to get much harder to ignore. Because what Thatch had proved at Midway was only the beginning. The real question was whether the United States Navy could spread this tactic fast enough, train enough pilots thoroughly enough before the Japanese figured out what was killing their men and found an answer. They never did. But the reason why the institutional decision that made the Japanese response impossible before it began is a story that starts not in the cockpit, but in a training program on the other side of the Pacific that was already eating itself alive. That is part 3. Thatch built a trap from matchsticks, proved it over San Diego Bay against Butch O'Hare, with throttles wired to half power. Then proved it again at Midway, with a dead radio, a 21-year-old wingman, and 15 Zeros trying to kill them both. The Weave worked, every single time, but the Japanese were still sending pilots to Rabaul, still launching strikes down the slot toward Guadalcanal, still believing that individual skill would eventually find an answer to whatever the Americans were doing. They were wrong, and the numbers were beginning to show it. By August of 1942, the Tainan Air Group at Rabaul, the unit that contained Saburo Sakai Hiroshi Nishizawa and the core of the Imperial Navy's elite fighter pilot community, had flown more than 1,400 individual combat sorties since the opening of the Guadalcanal campaign. Their losses in experienced pilots during that period were approaching 30%. Not aircraft, pilots. Men who had spent years in the Yokeren pipeline, who had been killing Allied aviators since China. Gone. And the commanders at Rabaul were beginning to understand with a cold clarity that their mission reports could not quite bring themselves to state directly that the Americans were doing something new. Commander Masahisa Saito, the Tainan Air Group's commanding officer, held a mission debrief at Rabaul in late August that his surviving pilots would later describe with something close to bafflement. The Zeros were getting bounced. Not by better pilots, not by faster aircraft. The Wildcat was still slower. It still couldn't climb with them. But 2 Wildcats flying together were defeating single Zeros every single time a Zero committed to an attack. The geometry was wrong in a way nobody could explain with the doctrine they had been taught. Saito drafted a report upward to 11th Air Fleet Headquarters at Truk. The report noted that American fighter pilots appeared to be using a coordinated pair defense that made solo attack runs non-viable. He requested analysis. He requested new tactics. He did not receive either in any usable form because the staff at Truk was facing the same problem the staff at Com Airpac had faced in Washington 6 months earlier. Acknowledging that the enemy had a superior tactical system meant acknowledging that your own doctrine was wrong. Institutions do not do that quickly or without pain, so the Zeros kept attacking in the pattern they knew, and the Wildcats kept killing them in the pattern Thatch had built. But inside the American system, something was also beginning to break. The Weave required 2 pilots who trusted each other completely and had practiced together enough to execute the turn-on instinct rather than thought. At Midway, Thatch had done it with a 21-year-old who had practiced once. That worked because Dib was exceptional, and because Thatch could afford to simplify the geometry in the air. Scaling that to every fighter squadron in the Pacific Fleet was a different problem entirely. By September of 1942, reports were coming back from the Cactus Air Force at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal that some pilots were attempting the Weave without adequate training and producing results that were, in the words of one Marine Squadron commander's after-action report, catastrophic for the pilot who broke at the wrong moment. The weave only worked if both pilots committed to the turn simultaneously. A pilot who hesitated, who saw the Zero coming and flinched back instead of turning into his partner, left his wingman exposed and himself isolated. 3 Wildcats at Henderson were lost in early September to botched weave executions. The senior Marine aviators at Cactus began questioning whether the maneuver was being taught correctly or whether it was simply too complex for pilots with fewer than 200 hours to execute reliably under fire. There was a meeting at Henderson in late September where a Marine lieutenant colonel told Thatch's doctrine indirectly but unmistakably to prove itself again or get out of the syllabus. Thatch was not there. He was preparing for something that would settle the argument permanently. October 26, 1942. The Battle of Santa Cruz Islands. The last carrier engagement of the Guadalcanal campaign. The Japanese committed 4 fleet carriers, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Zuiho, and Junyo, with a combined air group of more than 200 aircraft. The Americans had 2 Enterprise and Hornet. In raw numbers, this was the worst position the United States Pacific Fleet had been in since Midway. Both American carriers were in range of Japanese air attack. Both carrier air groups were outnumbered. The strike packages being launched from both sides were going to meet in the air over the open ocean south of the Santa Cruz Islands, and whoever controlled that airspace was going to decide whether the United States held Guadalcanal. James Flatley's Fighting Squadron 10, the Grim Reapers, was flying combat air patrol off the Enterprise that morning. Flatley had been drilling the weave into his pilot since he had flown against Thatch over Pearl Harbor in the spring. He had named it himself in the letter to Thatch. He trusted it the way you trust a tool you have used until it becomes part of your hand. At approximately 0900, a large formation of Japanese aircraft, Valskates and Zero escorts, was detected inbound. Flatley launched his division of 4 Wildcats to intercept. The Zeros came in fast and high. They had learned enough to approach from above, and with speed not to commit to a turning engagement, unless they were certain of the kill. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga, one of the Zuikaku's experienced fighter leaders, personally led the escort and had been briefed on the American tendency to fly in pairs. He intended to separate them before they could execute whatever it was that kept killing his pilots. Shiga picked Flatley's section. He dove. Flatley turned into him. The second section, right on cue, turned toward Flatley. Shiga found himself closing on a Wildcat that was turning to meet him, while a second Wildcat was already pointing at him from his left quarter. He broke off, climbed, reset, dove again from a different angle. Same result. The Wildcats turned. The second pair was already there. Shiga made 4 attack runs against Flatley's section. 4 times the geometry trapped him. 4 times he broke off. He never fired a round that found a Wildcat. He later stated in his after-action report that the American fighters appeared to be using a rotation system that made it impossible to achieve a firing position without simultaneously presenting yourself to a second attacker. He recommended the tactic be studied and countered. No counter was ever developed in time to matter. While Shiga was failing to kill Flatley, the Wildcat divisions that had peeled off to intercept the incoming strike packages were using the weave to tear through the Val and Kate formations. The Japanese lost 26 aircraft in the air battle over Santa Cruz, against 26 American aircraft, lost a ratio that looks even on paper, but conceals a critical asymmetry. The Americans lost aircraft. The Japanese lost experienced pilots. Men who could not be replaced in weeks or months. Men who had taken years to build. The Enterprise was hit. The Hornet was sunk. The Americans absorbed the tactical loss and held the strategic one. Guadalcanal stayed in Marine hands. The numbers after Santa Cruz told a story that had no good ending for the Imperial Navy. The Shokaku Air Group had lost more than 40% of its experienced pilots in the 3 months since the Guadalcanal campaign began. Zuikaku's air group was in comparable condition. The carriers themselves could be repaired. The men could not be replicated fast enough to matter. Within 3 months of Santa Cruz, every Wildcat squadron in the South Pacific had the weave in its standard tactical playbook. Joe Foss, the Marine pilot, who would finish Guadalcanal with 26 confirmed kills and a Medal of Honor, used variants of it throughout the campaign. When the F-6F Hellcat began replacing the Wildcat in fleet squadrons in late 1943, it carried the Weave as standard doctrine baked into its tactical manual from day one. The Hellcat was faster than the Wildcat and nearly as maneuverable as the Zero. Given the Weave on top of those advantages, the result was not a contest. The F-6F achieved a kill ratio against the Zero of better than 13-1. The Weave had started as a solution to an impossible problem: how to keep an inferior aircraft alive against a superior one. What it became was the foundation of American carrier fighter doctrine for the rest of the war. It transferred from the Wildcat to the Hellcat without modification because the geometry did not depend on the aircraft. It depended on the pilot's willingness to trust the man beside him over his own instinct to turn away from danger. That principle, trust the geometry, trust your wingman turn into the threat, proved durable in ways Thatch never claimed to have intended. But the man who built it on a kitchen table in Coronado was about to be asked a question that he had never considered when he was moving matchsticks in the dark. Not whether the Weave worked. That was settled at Midway and finished at Santa Cruz. The question was what it meant. What it said about the nature of skill and system and survival. Why two ordinary pilots following one simple rule could defeat one exceptional pilot following the finest doctrine in the world. And whether the answer to that question had implications that went somewhere larger than the Pacific War. That is part 4, and it is the chapter that most histories of the Thatch Weave never reach. A matchbox, a kitchen table. A man who could not sleep after reading a report that told him his pilots were going to die. That is where this story started. In 3 parts we watched Jimmy Thatch build a geometric trap. From nothing, prove it against the finest test pilot in his squadron, with his throttles wired to half-power fly it in actual combat at Midway with a 21-year-old wingman and a dead radio. And watch it spread across every carrier fighter squadron in the Pacific, until the kill ratio shifted so dramatically that Japanese commanders stopped being able to explain their own losses in mission reports. But there is a question that 4-star admirals and aviation historians and the men who flew the Weave themselves rarely asked aloud. What happened to the people who made it real? What did the rest of their lives look like after the geometry held and the war turned and the matchsticks were put away? The answer is more complicated and more human than the tactical record suggests. Butch O'Hare, who had tested the Weave for Thatch above San Diego Bay, and declared with his flight helmet still buckled that it really worked, did not live to see the war end. On the night of November 26, 1943, he was leading a 3-aircraft section from the Enterprise on what would have been one of the first nighttime carrier fighter intercepts ever attempted, a mission that was itself an act of tactical innovation in the tradition of everything Thatch had taught him. In the confusion of the dark engagement with American and Japanese aircraft, tangled above a task force, blacked out against submarine attack, O'Hare's Hellcat went down. His body was never recovered. He was 29 years old. The Chicago airport that 40 million people pass through every year was renamed for him in 1949. Most of them do not know his name or what he did to earn it. Robert Dib Ram, the Green Ensign who had executed the Weave on a hand signal at Midway with one practice session behind him, became an ace himself. 7 confirmed aerial victories. He was killed in a flying accident on August 29, 1944, 2 years and 2 months after the morning he made history above the Japanese fleet. He was 23. There is no monument to him anywhere. He appears as a footnote in most Midway accounts, if he appears at all. James Flatley, who named the Weave and drilled it into Fighting Squadron 10, and flew it himself against Lieutenant Shiga's Zeros at Santa Cruz, survived the war, rose to vice admiral, and died in 1958. He is remembered in naval aviation circles and almost nowhere else. Saburo Sakai, the man whose barracks conversations at Rabaul had framed the question. This entire story was built around lived longer than anyone. He died on September 22, 2000 at 84 years old. He had become a Buddhist who refused to kill any living thing. He had become a public critic of the war that had taken his eye and most of his generation. In 1983, a historian named Henry Sakida arranged a meeting in Los Angeles between Sakai and Harold L. Jones, the rear gunner from Bombing 6, whose machine gun burst had shattered Sakai's canopy over Tulagi 41 years earlier. They exchanged gifts. They shook hands. Sakai produced the bullet-pierced flying helmet he had worn that day, still carrying the mark of Jones's marksmanship. Two old men in a quiet room, both of whom had survived something neither one had any right to survive. Jimmy Thatch himself outlasted nearly all of them and never stopped working. He commanded the escort carrier USS Sicily in the Korean War. He pioneered anti-submarine warfare doctrine in the late 1950s, developing the hunter-killer task group tactics that became the template for how the United States Navy hunted Soviet submarines for the entire Cold War, which means that the same mind that built the weave on a kitchen table also built a significant portion of how the West protected the Atlantic Ocean for 40 years. He was promoted to 4-star admiral in 1965. He retired in May of 1967 as Commander-in-Chief, United States Naval Forces Europe. He died in Coronado, California on April 15, 1981, 4 days before his 76th birthday in the same town where the weave was born. When interviewers asked him about it in his later years, he deflected consistently. He credited O'Hare for testing it. He credited Flatley for naming it. He credited his pilots for trusting it under fire. He almost never used the first person when describing what had happened. The tactic he built on that table did not retire when he did. United States Navy F-4. Phantom crews flying over North Vietnam in the 1960s used variations of the weave against MiG-17s, whose turning performance gave them an advantage over the Phantom in a slow engagement. The same fundamental problem Thatch had faced with the Zero in 1941. The geometry still worked, the principle still held. Two aircraft watching each other's tails turning into the threat, denying the attacker a clean firing solution from any angle. The specific aircraft changed. The physics did not. The United States Air Force's dissimilar air combat training program, formalized after the Vietnam War, built its entire curriculum around the lesson. Thatch had proved empirically that a pilot trained to fight as part of a coordinated pair consistently outperforms a pilot of equal or greater individual skill who fights alone. Top Gun, the Navy Fighter Weapons School established at Miramar in 1969, partly in response to the Vietnam kill ratio crisis, teaches the same principle in its first week. Every Western air combat training course currently in operation incorporates mutual support geometry derived from what Thatch worked out with matchsticks. The Thatch Weave has been in continuous operational use in one form or another for more than 80 years. The total number of American pilots whose lives were extended or saved by the adoption of the weave across Pacific carrier aviation cannot be calculated with precision. The shift in kill ratios can. The Wildcat flying doctrine without the weave in the early months of the Pacific War achieved roughly 1-3 against the Zero. With the weave as standard doctrine, the same aircraft produced ratios approaching 7-1. The F-6F Hellcat, flying the weave from its first operational deployment, achieved better than 13-1. The Japanese lost an estimated 9,000 carrier-trained aviators during the Pacific War. The men who survived the Yokorin pipeline in the 1930s and flew the first year of combat were dead by 1943 in numbers that made recovery impossible. The weave did not win the Pacific War alone. But it was the first moment when the American system proved it could defeat the Japanese individual, and it was never reversed. The Bi-Huck. And there is one that cuts deeper than the tactical record is not about aircraft or geometry or even courage. It is about what happens when you refuse the answer that the evidence is giving you, because accepting it would require you to change something fundamental about how you understand yourself. The Imperial Japanese Navy built the finest individual fighter pilot community in the world. The Yokorin program was a genuine achievement. Sakai and Nishizawa and the men who flew with them were not inferior. They were in the summer of 1942, probably the best the world had to offer. But the system that produced them could not scale, could not absorb losses, could not train replacements fast enough to survive a long war, and could not accept a piece of doctrine that required its pilots to subordinate individual brilliance to collective geometry. The Zero was built around the individual ace. The training was built around the individual ace. The doctrine was built around the individual ace. To answer the Weave, the Imperial Navy would have had to tell its pilots that no single man, no matter how skilled, could consistently defeat two coordinated opponents, and that survival required trusting the man beside you more than your own virtuosity. They could not bring themselves to do it. They kept sending extraordinary men up to die alone, against opponents who had already agreed not to fight that way. The Americans were not on average better pilots. They were part of a better system. A system that did not depend on the exceptional individual, because it had been designed partly by accident and partly by the quiet insistence of one soft-spoken man from Arkansas to make teamwork transferable. To make it something you could teach a green ensign in an afternoon and trust him to perform in combat the next morning with a hand signal across a cockpit gap as his only instruction. Here is the detail that most accounts of the Thatch Weave omit entirely, because it seems almost too small to matter, and turns out to matter completely. After the war, when aviation historians began reconstructing the tactical evolution of Pacific carrier fighting, they tracked down the original matchboxes. Not a metaphor. The actual matchboxes Thatch had used on his kitchen table in Coronado during those weeks in the autumn of 1941. His wife Malene had kept them in a kitchen drawer throughout the war, through his deployments, through the years in Coronado, through the move that followed his retirement. When a Naval Institute researcher visited the Thatch home in the 1970s to collect material for his oral history project, Malene produced them without ceremony, the way you produce something you have kept, because throwing it away never felt right. A handful of ordinary matchsticks in an ordinary box. The researcher asked Thatch whether he wanted to say anything about them for the record. Thatch looked at them for a moment and said that they were just matches. Then he said that the thing that had mattered was not the matches, but the problem, and that the problem had been people, not airplanes, and that the solution had also been people, and that was probably all there was to say about it. From a kitchen table in Coronado, California, to the briefing rooms of every Western Air Force currently flying combat aircraft, one man's refusal to accept that his pilots had to die for lack of a better idea produced a geometric principle that has been in continuous use for more than 8 decades across 4 wars in aircraft that Thatch never lived to see. He saved lives he never knew about in conflicts he never flew in, with a tactic he built from matchsticks before the war that required it had even begun. The men who built the most elite pilot corps in the world were beaten by men who had decided quietly, and without fanfare, that no one fights best alone. That is the answer to the question Saburo Sakai's pilots could not stop asking each other in the barracks at Rabaul in August of 1942. And it is still the correct answer. It will probably always be the correct answer. If this story gave you something to carry with you, leave a comment below. If your father or grandfather flew in the Pacific, or worked the carrier decks, or served in the air groups that made these campaigns possible, share what you know. The specific details, the unit, the aircraft, the small personal things that the official record doesn't hold, those deserve to be kept. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many of these stories left. Most of them are about ordinary people who looked at a problem the world said was unsolvable and sat down with whatever was at hand and solved it anyway.